On the morning of January 27, 1945, radar stations along the Pacific approaches to the Kanto Plain detected fast-moving aircraft at an altitude higher than the incoming bomber formation. The speed readings did not match previously recorded escort profiles. Controllers marked the contacts separately, assuming temporary distortion or misidentification. Minutes later, fighter units scrambling from airfields west of Tokyo encountered single-engine aircraft already positioned above their climb paths. These aircraft were not attached to the bomber formation and were moving independently across the interception corridors. Pilots reported being engaged before reaching assigned altitude. Several aircraft were hit during climb. Others were forced to abandon interception due to fuel state after extended maneuvering. Gun camera film later showed brief flashes of silver aircraft crossing the frame at high speed. No bomber contact was recorded by those flights. At multiple airfields, takeoffs were delayed after reports of strafing along runway approaches. Ground crews noted damage to aircraft parked in dispersal areas before bombers appeared over the city. Anti-aircraft batteries logged fast targets maneuvering beyond expected patterns. Communications logs show overlapping warnings, missed acknowledgements, and abrupt signal loss. By the time the bombers reached Tokyo airspace, several interceptor units had already expended fuel and ammunition. Escort fighters remained overhead after bomb release. Landing approaches were contested. Some aircraft did not return. The daily reports closed with standard entries, but the plots no longer matched the procedures. The airspace above Tokyo no longer behaved as expected. In the winter months of 1944 to 1945, aerial activity over the Japanese home islands intensified in frequency and altitude. Daily operational summaries compiled by the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service recorded repeated incursions by high-altitude American bombers approaching the Kanto Plain. These aircraft were identified through radar contacts, visual sightings, and post-mission reconnaissance assessments as Boeing B-29 bombers operating from bases in the Mariana Islands. Japanese fighter units assigned to the defense of the Tokyo metropolitan area maintained standing alert procedures that included readiness rosters, fuel allocation schedules, and dispersal orders for aircraft stationed at airfields surrounding Tokyo Bay, Chofu, Tachikawa, Yokota, Atsugi, and Naramesu. Interception attempts during this period were conducted under conditions of fuel scarcity, limited climb performance, and increasingly constrained maintenance resources. During earlier bomber approaches, Japanese pilots had generally expected to encounter escorting fighters only at considerable distance from the target area or not at all. Operational experience through late 1944 indicated that American escort fighters, primarily P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, lacked the range to remain with the bombers to the Tokyo area. Air defense planning documents reflected this expectation and concentrated fighter deployment timing on the arrival of bombers over the outer defense zones. Interceptor climb profiles and vectoring instructions issued by ground controllers were structured accordingly, with emphasis on single-pass attacks against bomber formations rather than prolonged engagements with fighter escorts. By early 1945, reports began to appear in operational logs noting the presence of unfamiliar single-engine American fighters at higher altitudes and closer to the bomber formations than previously recorded. Initial descriptions included references to streamlined fuselages, laminar wings, and distinctive exhaust configurations. These sightings were first noted in scattered after-action reports from fighter units engaging bomber streams approaching from the southeast. Identification sections of these reports listed the aircraft as possible new variants or modified versions of known American types. Confirmation of the aircraft as North American P-51 fighters appeared in subsequent intelligence summaries compiled from captured documents, aerial photography, and correlation with Allied aircraft production data. The first recorded encounters involving these fighters over the Kanto region occurred during daylight bombing missions conducted under clear weather conditions. Japanese radar stations detected bomber formations at extended range, and standard scramble orders were issued. Fighters climbed through layered cloud formations to assigned interception altitudes. Upon visual contact, pilots observed that the bomber formations were accompanied by escorting fighters maintaining station at similar altitude and speed. These fighters were noted to maneuver freely around the bomber formations, performing wide turns and maintaining energy during altitude changes. Japanese pilots attempting to approach the bombers found themselves intercepted at distances previously unguarded. Combat reports from these engagements documented that the escorting fighters initiated contact proactively, diving from higher altitude to engage climbing interceptors. Pilots described the American fighters as maintaining speed during extended maneuvers and retaining control authority at high altitude. Gun camera footage recovered from damaged Japanese aircraft and reviewed by intelligence officers showed fleeting images of silver-colored fighters crossing the frame at high relative speed. Ammunition expenditure records indicated increased usage during these encounters, reflecting extended engagements rather than brief firing passes. As these encounters became more frequent, airfield operations around Tokyo adjusted accordingly. Maintenance crews were instructed to modify fueling procedures to allow fighters to launch with maximum possible fuel loads despite the resulting reduction in climb rate. Armament officers recalculated ammunition loads to balance endurance with weight constraints. Flight leaders received updated briefings emphasizing evasive tactics against escort fighters prior to bomber engagement. These briefings referenced the observed characteristics of the American aircraft, including rapid acceleration in dives and sustained performance at altitude. Japanese pilots flying aircraft such as the Ki-43 Hayabusa, Ki-44 Shoki, Ki-61 Hien, and naval types like the A-6M0 reported varying outcomes in these encounters. The Ki-43 units noted difficulty in matching speed and climb once engaged. Ki-44 pilots reported that their aircraft could initially reach the bombers but were vulnerable during turning engagements with the escorts. Ki-61 pilots recorded instances of brief parity in level flight at altitude but noted reduced maneuverability when carrying full armament loads. Naval aviators operating from land bases observed that their aircraft, while agile at lower speeds, were at a disadvantage in sustained high-speed engagements. Operational records show that during several missions over Tokyo, Japanese fighters were forced to jettison external fuel tanks prematurely in order to engage escorts, reducing available flight time for subsequent interception attempts. Ground control stations logged increasing difficulty in maintaining situational awareness as engagements expanded horizontally and vertically across the airspace. Radio transcripts summarized in intelligence digests indicate frequent loss of contact between controllers and pilots due to signal interference, damage to equipment, or rapid movement of aircraft beyond effective communication range. American fighter behavior over the Tokyo area was described in Japanese reports as coordinated and persistent. Escorts were observed maintaining continuous coverage of bomber formations during ingress, target approach, and egress phases. Pilots noted that the fighters remained present even after bomb release, engaging interceptors attempting pursuit. This differed from earlier experiences in which escorts disengaged prior to the target area. The sustained presence of these fighters was documented in time-stamped logs showing contact durations extending beyond previous norms. Weather reports attached to mission summaries provide additional context. Clear skies at high altitude allowed for early visual detection, while haze and industrial smoke over the city reduced contrast at lower levels. Pilots descending through this haze reported difficulty reacquiring targets once contact was broken. Escort fighters were noted to use the sun position to advantage, approaching from angles that reduced visibility to defenders. These observations were recorded without accompanying analysis, presented as factual notes for dissemination to other units. Damage assessments compiled after these engagements included both aircraft losses and airframe damage from machine gun fire. Maintenance logs recorded bullet strikes concentrated in wing roots, fuselage sides, and engine compartments. Several aircraft returned with control cable damage or coolant leaks consistent with fire from .50 caliber weapons. Loss reports filed by unit commanders listed aircraft missing or destroyed during escort engagements without confirming bomber destruction. Training directives issued during this period included amendments to interception doctrine. These documents instructed pilots to expect escort fighters at all stages of bomber approach and to operate in mutually supporting elements. Diagrams included in the directives depicted anticipated escort positions relative to bomber formations. The language of these documents remained procedural, outlining steps to be taken rather than reasons for their adoption. By the time repeated missions brought escort fighters regularly over Tokyo, air defense units had accumulated a body of empirical observations. Sortie counts indicated increased attrition among interceptor units. Fuel consumption logs showed higher average usage per sortie due to prolonged combat. Replacement aircraft deliveries failed to match loss rates, as reflected in inventory records. Despite these constraints, daily readiness reports continued to list assigned aircraft numbers, pilot availability, and expected response times. Throughout this period, Japanese pilots recorded their observations in standardized report formats immediately following landing, when possible. These reports focused on time of contact, altitude, enemy aircraft type, maneuvers observed, rounds fired, and outcome. References to the P-51 aircraft appeared with increasing consistency in the identification sections. Descriptions remained factual, noting performance characteristics and engagement sequences without additional commentary. As spring approached, the presence of these escort fighters became an established element of daylight operations over Tokyo. Radar operators adjusted tracking annotations to include both bomber and fighter symbols. Air raid warnings issued to civil defense authorities continued to be based on bomber detection, but internal military communications acknowledged the expanded threat environment in the airspace. All of these developments were recorded as part of the ongoing operational record, reflecting the conditions encountered by pilots and ground personnel during the defense of Tokyo under sustained aerial attack. As daylight operations continued into the early months of 1945, the presence of American escort fighters over the Tokyo region became a recurring entry in operational documentation. Morning readiness reports from Air Defense Headquarters listed anticipated bomber approach windows based on radar intelligence and previous patterns. Fighter units received scramble orders with reduced warning time due to earlier detection of escort fighters operating ahead of bomber formations. Ground crews prepared aircraft under conditions of repeated alerts, often without standing down between sorties. Aircraft servicing logs show accelerated turnaround procedures, including rapid refueling and rearming conducted while engines were still warm. During successive raids, Japanese pilots encountered P-51 fighters operating in organized elements, often at altitudes equal to or above the bombers. Flight path reconstructions derived from radar plots and pilot reports indicate that these fighters established patrol lines along expected interceptor climb routes. Pilots climbing to engage bombers reported being intercepted before reaching firing position. Engagements frequently began with diving attacks by the escort fighters, followed by climbing turns that restored altitude advantage. Japanese pilots attempting to follow these maneuvers noted loss of airspeed and separation from wingmen. Unit records from the 10th Sentai and 244th Sentai detail multiple sorties launched in response to bomber alarms in which no contact with bombers was achieved due to sustained engagement with escorts. Time on station figures show that fighters expended a significant portion of fuel reserves before reaching the bomber formations. Several aircraft were forced to disengage and return to base due to fuel state, as recorded in landing reports. These reports include timestamps, remaining fuel estimates, and observed enemy activity during disengagement. Naval air units operating from Atsugi and Yokosuka documented similar patterns. Their daily operational summaries note encounters with single-engine fighters exhibiting high cruising speed and stable gun platforms. Pilots reported that these aircraft maintained formation discipline during maneuvers and rejoined quickly after individual engagements. Naval maintenance sections recorded damage consistent with concentrated bursts rather than scattered fire, indicating controlled firing passes. Air defense communications logs reveal increased radio traffic during these encounters. Controllers issued frequent vector corrections as interceptors attempted to avoid escorts while still approaching bombers. Instances of overlapping commands and missed acknowledgements appear in transcripts, reflecting the congestion of airspace and communication channels. Several pilots reported losing situational awareness due to multiple simultaneous threats at different altitudes. Aircraft performance data compiled by technical officers included post-flight pilot statements regarding climb rates, acceleration, and control response relative to the American fighters. These statements were aggregated into reference sheets distributed within units. The language remained descriptive, noting observed speeds, angles of climb, and engagement distances. No evaluative language was included beyond the factual description of events as experienced in flight. During a series of raids in February 1945, escort fighters were observed operating independently of bomber formations for extended periods over the Tokyo area. Pilots reported sightings of P-51 fighters conducting sweeps ahead of the bombers, engaging airfields and interceptors shortly after takeoff. Airfield damage reports from this period list strafing incidents resulting in damaged aircraft on the ground, fuel storage fires, and casualties among ground personnel. These incidents were logged with time, location, and estimated number of attacking aircraft. In response, airfield commanders implemented dispersal measures, moving aircraft to revetments and utilizing camouflage nets. Aircraft were fueled and armed at dispersed points to reduce vulnerability. Despite these measures, subsequent raids continued to include fighter sweeps. Runway repair logs show repeated patching of surface damage caused by machine gun fire and light ordnance. Pilot training memoranda issued during this period emphasized immediate climb and evasive action upon takeoff when enemy fighters were present. These memoranda included procedural steps for aborting takeoff if strafing was observed and for emergency landing in damaged condition. The instructions were distributed as mimeographed sheets and appended to unit standing orders. Engagement summaries from mid-February include detailed accounts of multi-aircraft dogfights occurring above and around the bomber formations. Japanese pilots reported difficulty maintaining visual contact with multiple enemy fighters executing high-speed passes. Loss reports list several aircraft destroyed during these engagements, with causes attributed to enemy fighter fire based on witness statements and wreckage examination. Recovery teams documented crash sites within and outside the metropolitan area, noting aircraft serial numbers and pilot identification when possible. Medical logs from base infirmaries recorded an increase in pilots treated for wounds sustained during escort engagements. These logs include descriptions of injuries, treatment administered, and disposition of personnel. Several pilots were returned to duty after brief recovery periods, while others were transferred to hospital facilities. Personnel rosters were updated accordingly. As raids continued, intelligence sections compiled comparative tables of enemy aircraft sightings. These tables listed frequency of appearance, estimated numbers, and observed behavior patterns. The P-51 aircraft appeared with increasing regularity, often outnumbering interceptors at altitude. These observations were circulated within air defense commands to inform daily briefings. Weather reconnaissance reports indicate that escort fighters operated in a wide range of conditions, including overcast layers and variable winds. Pilots reported that the American fighters maintained formation integrity during turbulence and cloud penetration. Japanese interceptors attempting to use cloud cover for concealment reported being pursued through cloud layers. These encounters were recorded with altitude and weather data but without additional interpretation. Fuel supply reports during this period reflect the strain of extended engagements. Allocation tables show reduced reserves and prioritization of certain units. Some fighter units received limited fuel allotments, restricting the number of sorties flown per day. Commanders adjusted readiness states accordingly, as documented in daily status reports. Despite these constraints, air defense operations continued with established procedures. Scramble orders, interception attempts, engagement reports, and recovery operations followed standard formats. The presence of P-51 escort fighters was treated as a routine element of the operational environment, noted consistently in records without alteration of reporting style. By late February, cumulative documentation from multiple units presented a consistent picture of air combat conditions over Tokyo. Escort fighters accompanied bombers throughout the mission profile and conducted independent operations in the area. Japanese pilots and ground personnel continued to record their observations in logs, reports, and memoranda, creating a detailed contemporaneous record of the evolving air situation over the capital region. By March 1945, the operational tempo over the Kanto Plain increased further, with multiple raids occurring within short intervals. Air Defense Headquarters issued overlapping alerts as bomber streams approached from varying bearings. Fighter units were tasked with maintaining continuous readiness throughout daylight hours. Logs from Tachikawa and Chofu airfields record aircraft being launched, recovered, refueled, and relaunched within the same operational window. Maintenance personnel documented rising instances of deferred repairs due to lack of replacement parts and limited time between sorties. Escort fighters were recorded arriving over the Tokyo area ahead of the main bomber formations. Radar stations detected fast-moving contacts at high altitude preceding the larger formations by measurable intervals. These contacts were plotted and reported as probable fighters. Interceptor units climbing to investigate encountered P-51 aircraft operating in pairs and larger groups. Engagement reports described these fighters initiating combat without waiting for bombers to appear in visual range. Pilots noted that these engagements occurred at altitudes previously used for assembly and climb, altering established interception timelines. During these encounters, Japanese pilots reported that the P-51 aircraft maintained speed during extended vertical maneuvers. Attempts to disengage downward were often followed by renewed attacks from above. Several reports note that escorts appeared to coordinate attacks, with one aircraft engaging while another maintained altitude. These descriptions were recorded as observed sequences of movement and fire. Gun camera film reviewed by unit intelligence sections showed repeated high-speed crossing passes consistent with these accounts. Bomber formations arriving after these preliminary engagements were noted to be intact and closely escorted. Pilots attempting to penetrate the escort screen reported immediate interception. Firing opportunities against bombers were limited to brief windows during moments of distraction or separation. Ammunition expenditure logs reflect reduced firing time against bombers and increased use against fighters. Several pilots recorded returning to base with unused bomber-specific ammunition due to lack of engagement opportunity. Ground-based anti-aircraft units reported similar observations. Fire control logs note that escort fighters were present within the effective ceiling of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Gunners recorded tracking difficulties due to high speed and rapid altitude changes. Some batteries reported firing on fighters maneuvering near bomber formations, while others held fire to avoid interference with friendly aircraft. Coordination messages between air defense sectors reflect these adjustments in real time. Airfield defense logs from early March document repeated strafing attacks conducted by escort fighters. These attacks targeted aircraft on dispersal areas, fuel trucks, and parked maintenance equipment. Damage reports list aircraft rendered non-operational before launch, fires in fuel storage areas, and casualties among ground crews. Emergency response teams recorded response times, firefighting measures, and evacuation procedures. These incidents were logged as part of routine-based defense records. Personnel rosters show increasing turnover among experienced pilots. Losses, injuries, and fatigue resulted in reassignment and replacement by less experienced personnel. Training records indicate accelerated familiarization flights conducted between alerts. Instructors documented abbreviated training cycles focused on takeoff, climb, and emergency procedures rather than extended combat maneuvering. These measures were recorded as administrative actions without accompanying explanation. During mid-March raids, escort fighters were observed remaining over the Tokyo area for extended durations after bombers had departed. Pilots returning to base reported being intercepted during landing approaches. Several aircraft were damaged while on final approach or shortly after takeoff for subsequent sorties. Air traffic control logs record emergency diversions to alternate fields due to hostile air activity over primary bases. Communications transcripts from this period show increased use of brevity codes and abbreviated transmissions. Controllers issued warnings regarding enemy fighters in the vicinity of airfields and climb corridors. Pilots acknowledged these warnings when possible, though several transcripts note loss of contact shortly thereafter. Signal units reported equipment damage from nearby explosions and electromagnetic interference affecting transmission clarity. Intelligence summaries compiled during this period included consolidated timelines of escort fighter activity. These summaries listed times of first contact, estimated numbers, altitudes, and behavior patterns. P-51 fighters were consistently identified by silhouette and performance characteristics. Identification confidence increased as repeated sightings confirmed earlier reports. These summaries were distributed to operational units as reference material. Weather conditions during March varied, with intermittent cloud cover and shifting winds. Escort fighters were reported operating above cloud layers and descending through openings to engage interceptors. Japanese pilots attempting to use cloud cover for concealment reported being engaged upon emergence. Weather logs attached to mission reports provide detailed data on cloud base, visibility, and wind speed at various altitudes. Aircraft loss records from this period show a rising proportion attributed to fighter engagement rather than bomber defensive fire. Wreckage examination reports list damage patterns consistent with fighter gunfire, including concentrated impacts and engine failure. Recovery teams documented crash locations and aircraft condition. In some cases, wreckage was not recovered due to urban destruction or inaccessible terrain, and losses were recorded based on last contact reports. Medical and personnel records continued to track the human impact of these operations. Base hospitals recorded admissions related to air combat injuries, including burns, shrapnel wounds, and trauma from forced landings. Medical officers logged treatments and outcomes in standard forms. Personnel officers updated unit strength reports daily, reflecting losses and returns to duty. By late March, air defense operations over Tokyo were conducted under conditions of continuous escort fighter presence. Interceptor pilots adjusted climb profiles and engagement tactics based on accumulated experience. These adjustments were reflected in revised standing orders and briefing notes. The language of these documents remained procedural, outlining steps to be taken during interception attempts. Throughout this period, Japanese pilots continued to document their encounters in post-flight reports. These reports maintained a consistent format, focusing on factual details such as time, altitude, aircraft type, and observed actions. References to American P-51 fighters appeared routinely, indicating their regular presence over the operational area. As March progressed toward its end, the cumulative record from airfields, radar stations, anti-aircraft units, and medical facilities presented a continuous account of daily operations under sustained aerial activity. Escort fighters remained an integral part of the air environment over Tokyo, and their actions were recorded as part of the ongoing operational situation without deviation from established documentation practices. In early April 1945, air defense reporting for the Tokyo area continued to register daytime bomber approaches with escort fighters present at altitude. Sector controllers at radar sites along the Pacific approaches plotted multiple groups of contacts that separated into fast-moving elements and larger formations. The fast-moving elements were recorded as preceding or flanking the main formations and were treated in controller notes as probable fighters. Scramble orders were transmitted to designated interceptor fields with the same format used in previous months, specifying bearing, estimated altitude, and estimated time to contact. Airfield logs at Tachikawa, Chofu, Naramesu, and at Tsuji show repeated launches under partial fuel allocation schedules, with aircraft departing in quick succession rather than as full-strength formations. Pilot after-action forms from these sorties record initial contact with escort fighters before the bombers could be approached. Interceptors climbing to assigned altitudes reported seeing P-51 aircraft at or above them, moving across the climb corridors and initiating attacks from a position of altitude advantage. The first passes were described as high-speed dives followed by climbing turns that carried the American fighters back above the engagement area. Japanese pilots recorded that these attacks were executed in sequence by multiple aircraft rather than as single, isolated passes. Reports list repeated instances in which the escort fighters disengaged briefly and then returned from another direction, often with the sun behind them when cloud conditions allowed. Aircraft serviceability reports from the same period document increasing limitations on engine output due to worn components and restricted availability of replacement parts. Maintenance notes include references to reduced maximum manifold pressure settings, oil consumption issues, and cooling system leaks. These technical entries are associated with reduced climb performance observed in operational flights. Flight line personnel recorded that aircraft were being launched with known minor defects that would ordinarily have been repaired prior to operational use, and these decisions were entered as deferment notes on inspection forms. Anti-aircraft coordination messages indicate that heavy gun batteries near Tokyo Bay and within the metropolitan defense sectors continued to receive bomber warnings and to track targets at altitude. Fire control logs include entries for aircraft maneuvering at high speed outside the bomber formations, corresponding to escort fighter activity. Several batteries recorded firing restrictions when friendly aircraft were operating in the same sector, and message traffic shows repeated attempts to deconflict fighter engagements with gunfire zones. These messages were transmitted through established channels, and copies were retained in sector files. In the days surrounding April 7, 1945, when Japanese naval air activity was recorded in other operational theaters, air defense records around Tokyo continued to focus on bomber approaches and escort presence. Daily situation summaries included map annotations showing contact points and estimated paths. Interceptor sortie records for these days list frequent engagements with fighters, limited bomber attacks, and high fuel expenditure. Several pilots reported returning without making a firing pass on bombers due to interception by escorts. These entries are included in unit diaries as operational outcomes, listing sortie numbers and aircraft status on return. Airfield defense sections recorded additional strafing incidents in April. Damage assessments list bullet strikes in parked aircraft, punctures in fuel drums, and damage to radio masts and light structures. Fire reports describe small fuel fires extinguished by base firefighting teams using sand, water, and available chemical extinguishers. Casualty lists included ground personnel wounded by strafing or shrapnel from secondary explosions. These lists were submitted through personnel channels and appended to base daily reports. To reduce vulnerability, dispersal plans were revised. Aircraft were moved to revetments at greater spacing, and ground crews were instructed to keep engine cowlings and maintenance tools under cover between alerts. Fueling points were relocated where possible, and fuel trucks were moved to sheltered areas when not in immediate use. These procedures were written into base orders and recorded as implemented in logs. Despite these measures, subsequent attacks continued to damage aircraft on the ground, particularly when escort fighters arrived over airfields during takeoff and landing windows. From mid-April, Japanese fighter commanders issued further procedural notes on engagement conduct. Briefing sheets directed pilots to avoid prolonged turning engagements at high altitude when escort fighters were present and to maintain element cohesion. Instructions emphasized mutual support and the use of altitude where available. These directives were distributed with standard administrative markings and filed as part of unit order books. Pilot reports reflect attempts to follow these procedures, describing formation turns, breakaways, and rejoining under fire. In multiple engagements recorded in April, pilots described the escort fighters as remaining in the area during and after bomber passage. Some reports indicate that P-51 aircraft were seen circling near likely landing approaches to airfields, and pilots returning to base described being attacked while reducing speed and altitude. Landing reports include entries for emergency belly landings, landing gear failures caused by hydraulic damage, and aircraft departing the runway due to compromised control surfaces. Maintenance crews documented damage and whether airframes were reparable. Aircraft categorized as beyond repair were stripped for usable parts, and this process was recorded in maintenance section inventories. As the month progressed, air defense radar stations reported increased interference and occasional equipment outages. Some outages were attributed in signal logs to power interruptions, nearby bombing damage, or component failure. During these periods, controllers relied on visual observation posts and telephone reports to estimate bomber approach. These limitations were noted in situation summaries as gaps in coverage. In several instances, scramble orders were issued on short notice based on late detection, resulting in interceptors climbing with insufficient time to reach optimum altitude before encountering escorts. On days with clearer weather, reconnaissance notes attached to fighter unit reports indicate that P-51 aircraft could be visually identified with greater certainty. Pilots recorded recognition based on wing shape, tail profile, and radiator intake. Intelligence officers added these identifications to compiled charts that listed enemy types and distinguishing features. These charts were distributed in unit briefing rooms and included procedural instructions for reporting sightings. The reporting language remained standardized, requiring time, altitude, direction, and estimated numbers. During the latter half of April, U.S. fighter activity over the Tokyo area included attacks on transportation nodes and airfields, recorded by Japanese civil defense and military authorities as strafing incidents and low-level bombing. Railway control offices and local police submitted incident reports noting damaged rolling stock, disrupted lines, and casualties. Military liaison officers compiled these reports and forwarded summaries to air defense commands. These summaries listed locations, times, and observed aircraft numbers. Several reports noted that attackers were single-engine fighters operating at low altitude and high speed, consistent with prior identification of P-51 aircraft. Air defense units attempted to adjust by maintaining some fighters at lower altitude readiness to respond to strafing attacks. Readiness rosters were modified to include immediate launch aircraft and pilots assigned to ground alert. These changes were recorded in unit daily orders. Fuel limitations continued to restrict sustained patrol operations, and most fighters remained committed to responding to bomber alarms rather than maintaining continuous coverage. The resulting pattern in logs shows repeated cycles of scramble, engagement, recovery, and rearm under pressure. In early May 1945, Japanese operational records continued to show frequent bomber warnings and escort fighter activity. Controllers reported that fast-moving contacts were often present at the edge of radar range, then rapidly approached the inner defense sectors. Pilots climbing to engage noted being attacked at higher altitudes than earlier in the year, indicating that escort fighters were operating above anticipated climb ceilings. Several pilots recorded that their aircraft reached the altitude of bomber formations only after expending significant fuel and that they were already under attack from escorts by the time they arrived. These reports contain fuel state estimates and time-to-climb figures, entered in the standard spaces provided on reporting forms. Airfield maintenance logs in May record increasing cannibalization of damaged aircraft to keep others operational. Inventory sheets list removed components such as magnetos, propeller governors, control cables, and instrument panels. The movement of parts was recorded with serial numbers and dates. The number of serviceable aircraft reported in daily readiness summaries declined at several fields. Unit commanders noted aircraft availability and pilot availability separately, with several entries showing pilots available but insufficient aircraft to launch in full strength. Loss reports continued to attribute many aircraft losses to fighter engagements rather than bomber defensive fire. Witness statements attached to loss reports describe aircraft being hit during escort attacks and entering dives, spins, or controlled descents that ended in ground impact. Recovery teams documented wreckage where possible, recording the location, condition, and any recovered personal effects. In urban areas, recovery was sometimes limited by ongoing fires, debris, or security conditions, and the absence of recoverable wreckage was noted in the forms. During mid-May raids, escort fighters were observed operating in larger numbers and across broader areas of the Kanto region. Pilots reported seeing multiple groups at different altitudes, some maintaining patrol patterns while others engaged interceptors. Reports describe simultaneous threats from above and from the sides, reducing the ability of Japanese pilots to position for bomber attacks. Engagement diagrams sketched by pilots and appended to reports show relative positions and headings at the moment of contact and during breakaways. These sketches were used as internal reference material and filed with unit intelligence sections. Air defense communications continued to show congestion. Controllers issued vectors to multiple flights, and pilot acknowledgments were sometimes incomplete. Several logs note instances where pilots transmitted that they were under attack and then ceased communication. Ground observers reported seeing aircraft trails and fires at altitude. These observations were entered as time-stamped entries in observation post logs. In some cases, parachutes were seen, and subsequent reports tracked pilot recovery efforts by local authorities and military police units. Throughout May, the operational environment around Tokyo included both daytime and nighttime air activity. Nighttime raids were recorded primarily as bomber operations, while daytime operations involved escorts and fighter sweeps. Fighter units tasked primarily for daytime interception recorded reduced opportunities to rest and maintain aircraft due to frequent alerts and recovery operations. Base administrative logs show increased entries for night work by maintenance crews, including engine changes and structural repairs conducted under limited lighting. These actions were recorded as part of routine maintenance documentation, with signatures and dates. Japanese pilots continued to submit post-flight reports that described P-51 performance characteristics as observed in combat. Entries include notes on speed during dives, climb recovery after attacks, and ability to maintain altitude advantage. Some reports described the American fighters using shallow dives to gain speed and then climbing back without significant loss of momentum. Other reports noted that attempts to engage from below were countered by quick rolls and dives by the escorts. These statements were recorded as observed sequences without additional language. In response to repeated escort engagements, some units attempted coordinated tactics in which one element would attract escort attention while another approached bombers. Reports describe limited success due to the escort's ability to reposition rapidly. Several pilots noted that when they attempted to split escorts from bombers, the escorts maintained coverage and continued to engage interceptors before they reached the bomber formation. These outcomes were recorded in the outcomes sections of reports as "no attack on bombers achieved" or "attack aborted due to fighters," consistent with reporting conventions. Airfield commanders continued to implement measures intended to preserve aircraft for interception. Orders included restrictions on unnecessary engine running, limits on training flights, and priority maintenance for aircraft assigned to immediate alert. These orders were distributed through base channels and recorded in administrative logs. Fuel allocation tables attached to monthly reports show reduced allotments and prioritized distribution to certain units and missions. These tables list quantities received, quantities issued, and remaining stocks. Civil defense documentation from Tokyo and surrounding municipalities recorded increased frequency of air raid warnings and the presence of aircraft over the city during daytime. Reports note the sound of aircraft engines, sightings of contrails, and observations of falling debris from aerial combat. Municipal reports include entries for unexploded ammunition and aircraft fragments recovered in streets and fields. These fragments were sometimes forwarded to military authorities for analysis, and receipt logs recorded the dates and locations of collection. As May progressed, Japanese air defense continued to face repeated operations involving escort fighters over the Tokyo area. The cumulative daily logs show that P-51 aircraft were present during bomber approaches, remained during egress, and conducted independent sweeps and strafing attacks on airfields and transportation. The record of these operations remained in the form of time-stamped entries, sortie lists, maintenance notes, damage assessments, and standardized pilot reports, reflecting the conditions encountered in the airspace over Tokyo during sustained American fighter activity. From late May into June 1945, defense reporting for the Kanto region continued to register daylight aerial activity with bomber formations and escort fighters operating over and around the Tokyo area. Radar plots retained in sector files show repeated patterns of large, steady tracks consistent with bomber streams and smaller, faster tracks moving along the flanks and ahead of the main formations. These plots were annotated with bearings, estimated altitude bands, and time marks, then forwarded by telephone and courier to Air Defense Headquarters. Scramble orders were issued according to established practice, with instructions transmitted to designated fighter fields and relayed locally to flight lines by runners, signal lamps, and field telephones when radio circuits were interrupted. At the airfields, readiness routines remained structured around immediate launch aircraft and pilots assigned to alert status. Daily muster sheets list pilots by name, aircraft assigned, and readiness time. Aircraft line books record engine start times, takeoff times, and landing times, with notes on abnormalities and damage. Ground crews prepared aircraft in dispersed revetments where available and used improvised shelters for tools and spare parts. Many entries in maintenance logs refer to shortened inspection cycles between sorties and repeated replacement of tires, brake components, and coolant hoses. Structural repair notes include patching of control surfaces with available sheet material and application of dope and fabric where metal skinning was not available. Operational reports from intercept missions in late May and early June continued to note contact with P-51 fighters before bomber formations could be approached. In several documented engagements, interceptors climbing toward the reported bomber altitude encountered American fighters at higher altitude executing diving attacks. Japanese pilots recorded these engagements using standardized reporting fields: time of first sighting, altitude, relative position, estimated enemy numbers, firing time, and observed result. Many reports list enemy fighters engaged, with no subsequent bomber contact, followed by return due to fuel state or aircraft damage. Fuel state figures recorded upon landing indicate that aircraft often returned with minimal reserves, and in several cases pilots reported landing with reserve tanks empty and main tanks at low level. During June daylight operations, escort fighters were recorded in multiple roles. Some were observed directly around bomber formations, maintaining coverage during ingress and egress. Others were recorded conducting separate sweeps across airfields and transportation corridors. Reports from observation posts and local military police detachments include sightings of low-flying single-engine fighters moving along rail lines, roads, and river valleys. These reports were collated in regional situation summaries and forwarded to air defense sectors. The summaries listed locations, time intervals, and estimated numbers of aircraft, with brief descriptions of flight direction and altitude. Airfield defense records for June include continued entries for strafing attacks. Tachikawa and Chofu field logs note attacks occurring during takeoff windows, with aircraft hit while still climbing away from the field. Atsugi records include damage to aircraft parked in dispersal and to fuel and ammunition handling areas. Damage reports list punctured fuel drums, burned equipment, and damaged vehicles. Fire brigade logs note alarms, response times, and extinguishing methods, including sand and water application and the use of chemical extinguishers when available. Casualty returns include names, unit affiliations, and disposition, filed through the same channels as earlier months. In response to airfield vulnerability, base orders continued to modify movement and storage procedures. Aircraft were moved at irregular intervals to reduce predictability. Fuel trucks were kept under cover until needed and moved immediately after fueling operations. Ammunition was stored in smaller distributed caches rather than centralized dumps where feasible. These measures appear as written directives appended to daily administrative records and confirmed by checklists signed by duty officers. Despite dispersal, repeated attacks produced additional aircraft categorized as unserviceable. Monthly readiness summaries show reduced operational counts, with some units reporting fewer aircraft available than pilots on the roster. During these late spring and early summer operations, Japanese units continued to conduct wreckage examination and recovery when possible. Recovery teams recorded crash locations, aircraft type, serial number, and observed damage. Photographs were sometimes taken and filed with reports. In areas where crash sites were inaccessible due to urban destruction, fires, or security limitations, the reports include notes that the site could not be fully examined. Witness statements collected from local residents, police, and military personnel were attached to loss reports. These statements generally described aircraft seen trailing smoke, entering dives, or breaking apart at altitude, followed by impact. Where parachutes were observed, subsequent entries tracked pilot recovery efforts, listing searches conducted and contacts with local authorities. Communications logs continued to show frequent interruptions. Radar stations reported periodic loss of power and component failures. Signal units filed maintenance tickets for damaged cables and transmitter components. When radar coverage was degraded, controllers relied on visual observer networks and reports from coastal observation points. Telephone relay logs include multiple instances of delayed reports arriving from observer posts due to damaged lines. In these situations, scramble orders were issued with reduced lead time, and interceptor flights climbed under pressure to reach altitude quickly. Pilot reports from these sorties include notes that they encountered escort fighters during climb and that they were engaged before reaching bomber altitude. Anti-aircraft units remained active during bomber approaches, with fire control logs showing time on target entries, ammunition expenditure, and observed aircraft behavior. Some logs include references to fighters maneuvering near bomber formations at high speed. Coordination messages between gun batteries and fighter control continued to be exchanged, including warnings of friendly aircraft in gun sectors and requests for clearance. These messages are filed in sector correspondence bundles with date stamps and routing notes. Throughout June, intelligence sections at fighter units continued to compile short reference summaries drawn from pilot reports and observation logs. These summaries listed the common features used to identify P-51 aircraft and noted observed tactics such as high-altitude coverage, diving attacks, and rapid repositioning. The summaries were distributed as briefing aids and appended to unit intelligence files. The language remained descriptive and procedural, specifying reporting requirements and cautioning pilots to expect fighters above them and around bomber formations. Gun camera film and photographs were catalogued where available, with log entries indicating date, sortie number, and whether usable imagery was obtained. By July 1945, daylight raids and fighter sweeps continued to be recorded in the Tokyo region. Daily operational diaries show repeated alerts, with scramble orders issued and aircraft launched from remaining serviceable inventories. Aircraft that could not be repaired were increasingly used as sources of parts. Maintenance sections recorded the stripping of engines, instruments, and armament components from damaged airframes. Inventory sheets list the movement of these parts and the aircraft to which they were fitted. Armament logs show continued efforts to maintain weapon function, with entries for cleaning, spring replacement, and adjustment of feed mechanisms. Ammunition allotment records indicate constraints, with some units reporting reduced issue per sortie. Pilot reports from July continue to record frequent encounters with P-51 fighters over the Kanto area. Many reports describe being attacked during climb, during attempted approach to bomber formations, and during withdrawal toward base. Several reports include notes that American fighters remained present even after bombers departed, and that returning aircraft were engaged near landing circuits. Emergency landing entries appear regularly in airfield logs, including belly landings due to landing gear damage, forced landings due to engine failure from coolant loss, and runway overruns due to compromised braking. Medical logs record treatment of pilots injured in these incidents, including burns, lacerations, and fractures, with outcomes recorded in standard medical forms. Civil and military authorities continued to collect and forward reports of aircraft activity over urban and rural areas. Municipal offices submitted incident reports noting aircraft fragments, unexploded ordnance, and damage to buildings and infrastructure associated with strafing and aerial combat. Police reports list times of aircraft sightings and describe the direction of flight. These reports were summarized by liaison officers and filed with regional situation reports. Some fragments and ammunition were forwarded to military technical sections for identification, and receipt logs recorded the origin and date of delivery. During this period, Air Defense Control continued to operate under reduced resources. Sector summaries note gaps in coverage caused by damaged equipment and reduced communications reliability. Airfield operations were constrained by limited fuel and by the vulnerability of takeoff and landing windows to fighter sweeps. Readiness rosters were adjusted to maintain immediate response capability with the aircraft and pilots available. These adjustments appear as amendments to duty schedules and alert lists, with signatures by commanders and duty officers. In early August 1945, Air Defense reporting for Tokyo continued to document bomber warnings and fighter activity. Situation summaries compiled at the time record contacts plotted by radar when available and sightings from observation posts. Scramble orders continued to be issued when fighter units could respond. Pilot reports from these days contain the same standardized fields and continue to reference escort fighters as present in the area. Airfield logs record launches, recoveries, and damage, with maintenance notes indicating continuing shortages and the use of remaining part stocks. Across the full span of records from winter through summer 1945, the documentation from fighter units, airfields, radar stations, anti-aircraft batteries, hospitals, and civil authorities maintained consistent forms and procedures. The entries record repeated daylight encounters in which P-51 fighters were present over Tokyo and the surrounding region, engaging interceptors, escorting bomber formations, and conducting sweeps and strafing attacks. The record is preserved in time-stamped plots, sortie lists, aircraft status reports, maintenance and inventory sheets, damage assessments, casualty returns, and pilot after-action forms, reflecting daily operations as they were written at the time.